He nailed up a sign asking for one thing: a cook. Nothing more. 3 weeks later, a broken wagon rolled up to his gate carrying a woman, 3 children, and the smell of warm bread. And by the time supper was over, the loneliest man in the territory had already broken every rule he swore he'd live by. This is the story of what happened next. Colorado, autumn of 1874. Out here the land only asked 2 things of a person. Could you take a beating? And would you still be standing after? If you had both, it let you stay. If you didn't, it sent you home with nothing but a story about how hard you tried. Ezra Caldwell had both. 44 years old, built solid as the fence posts he'd sunk into the ground with his own hands. His face looked less like it had aged and more like it had been carved. By wind, by cold, by too many mornings that started before the sun bothered to. His eyes were gray, the color of sky right before a storm, and they carried the flatness of a man who'd stopped expecting anything good a long time ago. His ranch sat in a quiet valley outside a small town called Millbrook. Good land creek on one side, hills on the other. 60 head of cattle. Not enough to make him rich. Just enough to keep his hands busy from before sunup to well past dark. So there was no spare minute left to sit still and feel anything. The house told the story before he ever said a word. A barn, an empty bunkhouse, used to sleep 3 hired hands until Ezra let them go one by one as his patience wore thinner than old rope. A coop, a root cellar, all of it working, all of it silent. He'd been married once. Her name was Clara. She came out from back east with her head full of adventure, and for a couple years it really was one. Then the adventure turned into routine, and the routine turned into loneliness, and the loneliness turned into a quiet, so heavy it finally pushed her out the door. She packed one bag on an ordinary Tuesday while he was out checking fence line, and by the time he rode home, she was already gone on the morning stage. No note. That was 9 years back. He hadn't said her name since. Cleared every trace of her out of that house with his own hands, boxed it up, carried it to the barn loft, and never climbed those stairs again. The house stopped being a home somewhere in there. It became a place a man slept and ate and stared into a fire that warmed his hands, but nothing else. He cooked badly. Beans, salted meat, coffee strong enough to strip paint. And he ate standing at the counter, because sitting down meant looking at the empty chair across from him. By that autumn, even a man that stubborn couldn't keep pretending he was fine. He'd lost weight. His shirts hung loose. He'd run out of energy halfway through an afternoon. The ranch was suffering because the rancher running it had forgotten how to feed himself. So he wrote out a notice. Plain pencil, plain paper. Cook wanted. Room and board provided. Caldwell Ranch, east of Millbrook. No cattle experience needed. Must not mind quiet. He nailed it outside the general store and rode home, expecting an answer within the week. Nobody came. A week turned into 2. 2 turned into 3. The paper curled at the edges from rain. The pencil marks faded, and Ezra kept eating burnt beans out of a pot. He'd stopped bothering to scrub. Then on the 23rd day, a wagon appeared on his road. Not much of a wagon. A beat-up farm cart, canvas stretched over bent hoops, pulled by a mule that looked as worn out as the cart. It moved slow and careful, like it was carrying more than it was built for. Ezra stood on the porch, arms crossed, already rehearsing his no. The wagon stopped at the gate. A woman climbed down. 29 years old, dark hair pulled back tight. Eyes tired, but sharp. The look of someone who'd carried a family on her back longer than anyone should have to. Her dress had probably been bright once. Now it was the color of a memory. Her boots were worn but cared for. She looked at the house, the barn, at Ezra standing there like a locked gate. Then 3 children climbed down behind her. The oldest was a boy, 11, dark-haired like his mother, with watchful eyes that had already learned not to trust good things too fast. His name was Caleb. The middle one was a girl, 7, curls that refused to stay pinned. A face set with the kind of stubborn will that had already decided the world wasn't going to win. Her name was Ruthie. The youngest, a boy of 4, gripped his mother's skirt with one hand and a carved wooden mule with the other, staring up at Ezra the way little kids stare up at mountains. Not scared. Amazed. His name was Tobias. The woman walked to the gate and looked Ezra dead in the eye. "I'm here about your notice," she said. "My name's Margaret Doyle. I can cook, Mr. Caldwell. But I come with 3 children. Not saying it to soften you up. Saying it because it's the truth. We come together. Or we don't come at all." Everything in Ezra told him to say no. He wanted a cook, not a family. Not noise, not small boots tracking through his kitchen. Not questions he had no answers for. He'd built his whole life to avoid exactly this moment. Instead, what came out was, "Can you make biscuits?" Even he looked surprised he'd asked it. "I can make biscuits that'll make you forget your own name," Margaret said. No bragging in it, just fact. Ezra stood there a long moment. Wind moved through the valley. A horse snorted in the coral. Tobias waved at him from behind his mother's skirt like they were already old friends. "Kitchen's through the front, on the left," Ezra said. "Bunkhouse is clean. You and the kids can have it. Meals at sunup noon and sundown. Pay comes monthly." He turned to go inside. "What about the quiet?" Margaret called after him. "Your notice said must not mind quiet." "I've got 3 kids, Mr. Caldwell. Quiet isn't something we carry a lot of." He stopped in the doorway and looked back at her. For the first time in longer than he could remember, something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The memory of where one used to live. "Guess I'll learn to live with noise instead," he said, and went inside. They moved into the bunkhouse that same afternoon. Margaret cleaned it top to bottom in under 2 hours. The kind of fast, no-nonsense clean that only comes from a woman who spent years making other people's spaces feel like home, because she rarely had one of her own. She hung the children's clothes on nails she drove into the wall herself. She set a small framed drawing of a wildflower on a shelf above the stove, because to her, a little beauty wasn't a luxury. It was something you needed just to keep going. That first supper, Ezra sat down at his own kitchen table for the first time in 3 years. Not standing at the counter like always. Sitting. Because Margaret had set a place for him. Plate, fork, napkin folded just so, in a way that told him someone in that house cared how things were done. She put the biscuits on the table. Golden, warm. The smell rolled through the kitchen and drifted into rooms that hadn't smelled like anything but dust and quiet for years. Ezra picked one up. Bit into it. Chewed slow. Something shifted behind those gray eyes. Something that had been frozen for 9 years starting, quietly to thaw. "These'll do," he said. Margaret almost smiled. She recognized a man protecting himself with understatement. She'd been married to one.
"I'll take two for now,"
she said. The children ate over in the bunkhouse, and Ezra could hear every bit of it through the walls. Laughter. Tobias singing something with no tune at all. Ruthie arguing with Caleb about chickens for reasons nobody could quite follow. By every rule Ezra lived by, that noise should have driven him up the wall. He'd asked for quiet. He'd built his whole life around it, used silence the way other men used barbed wire to keep things out. But sitting there with the best biscuit he'd had in a decade, listening to kids laughing through the wall, Ezra felt something he didn't have a name for. It felt like the opposite of silence. It felt like the house was breathing again. The days settled into a rhythm. He never agreed to out loud, but never fought either. Margaret cooked 3 meals a day, each one better than the last. Stews that warmed a man from the inside. Bread that made the whole house smell alive. Pies made from dried apples she'd carried across 3 states in that wagon. She scrubbed floors he'd neglected for years. Washed windows so clean they let real daylight into rooms that had forgotten what it looked like. Hung dried herbs from the kitchen ceiling until the air smelled like something between a garden and a memory. She never asked permission. She just saw what needed doing and did it, the way a woman does when she's been running things alone far too long and nobody ever noticed. Ezra watched it happen the way a man watches a river slowly reshape a canyon. He couldn't stop it. And somewhere along the way, he stopped wanting to. The children were harder to figure out. Caleb kept his distance, careful and watching, because he'd lost his own father in a mine collapse 2 years back and learned early that men you count on can vanish without warning. He did his chores. He answered when spoken to. His eyes tracked Ezra constantly, still waiting to find out when this one would disappear too. Ruthie was the opposite. Everywhere, all the time. In the barn poking at tools. In the coop counting eggs like she was auditing a bank. In the corral talking to horses that looked back at her with the same mild confusion Ezra usually wore. She asked questions the way rain falls, constant and without asking if the ground was ready. Why do cows all face the same way? Do horses dream? Why don't you ever smile, Mr. Caldwell? That last one caught him mid-motion, fixing a fence post on a Tuesday afternoon. I smile, Ezra said. I haven't seen it, Ruthie said. Maybe you're not smiling at the right times. I'm always looking, she added, matter of fact. And she was. That girl watched the whole world like she meant to understand every inch of it, whether it cooperated or not. Then there was Tobias, 4 years old, and the single most effective force Ezra had ever come across. That boy had no concept of personal space because he didn't know it existed yet. He trailed Ezra everywhere, sat beside him on the porch step, showed up at the fence line just to hold up his wooden mule for inspection. His name's Scout. Tobias told him one morning, good name, Ezra said, because there wasn't much else you could say to a 4-year-old holding a toy mule like it was a family heirloom. He's brave, Tobias went on. You can hold him if you want. Ezra took the small wooden mule and held it carefully, the way you hold something that matters enormously to someone who matters more than you expected. Thank you, he said. Tobias grinned with his whole face and wandered off, satisfied he'd handled the most important business of his morning. Ezra sat on that porch a long while after, holding a toy mule, feeling something shift in his chest. like walls he'd spent 9 years reinforcing, were being taken apart, not by force, but by a 4-year-old with a wooden animal, a 7-year-old who noticed he didn't smile enough, and a boy whose distrust felt like looking in a mirror. One evening, after the children were asleep, Margaret told Ezra her story. They sat on his porch. First time she'd ever sat there, while the sunset painted the whole valley gold. Her husband James had been a good man, a miner, not a drinker, not a dreamer, a worker. Went into the mountain every morning, came out every evening, put food on the table with hands that never got fully clean. Until one day, 2 years back, when he didn't come out, the mine caved in. She lost him that day. She said it without crying. She'd already done her crying, alone, at night, into a pillow that had to be dry by morning so the children wouldn't know. She sold what little they had, moved 3 times chasing work. Nobody wants to hire a woman with 3 children trailing behind her. They want a cook, not a family. You're the first person who said yes, she told Ezra. Ezra looked out at the valley, at the last color draining off the mountains. I said yes to the biscuits, he said quietly. The family was a surprise. And now, she asked. He was quiet a long moment. Somewhere in the bunkhouse. Tobias laughed in his sleep, a small bright sound carrying across the yard. Now I can't remember what quiet used to sound like, Ezra said. And I don't want to. Winter rolled in deep. First snow came in November, blanketing the valley white. Margaret kept the house warm and the food coming, and the children busy enough to keep Ruthie's increasingly ambitious plans for the barn from actually happening. And Ezra started doing things he hadn't done in years. He hauled the old rocking chair down from the barn loft, fixed it, and set it on the porch one morning without a word. Margaret found it that evening and rocked slow while the children played in the last light, and Ezra pretended to read a newspaper he'd already read twice. He carved Tobias a new wooden mule when Scout lost a leg. Left it on the bunkhouse step without announcing it. Tobias found it and carried it over like he'd witnessed a miracle. Scout's got a friend now, he said. Every scout needs a partner, Ezra told him. He worked beside Caleb through the winter, not lecturing, not instructing, just present, day after day, showing that boy a man could stick around without vanishing. It took 3 months of quiet, side-by-side work before Caleb asked his first real question. Did you build this fence yourself? I did. Can you teach me? Ezra handed him the hammer, and in that small exchange, something in both of them started to heal. He built Ruthie a little shelf in the coop to keep her egg-counting ledger dry. She thanked him with a weekly report more detailed than some government documents. Spring came. Snow melted. The creek ran high. The valley turned green. And that house, the one that had been a cold, functional box for a lonely man, became something else entirely. Loud. Full of small boots by the door and drawings on the wall, and a wooden mule named Scout, and his partner standing guard on the windowsill. It became home. Ezra and Margaret never once talked about what was growing between them out loud. They said it the way people out here always say, the important things through action. Coffee ready every morning. Evenings spent together on the porch. The slow, careful orbit of 2 people circling each other and pretending it was all coincidence. She mended his shirts without being asked. He fixed the bunkhouse roof before the spring rains came. She left him a slice of pie on the counter after supper. He left wildflowers in a jar by the kitchen window. Pie and wildflowers. As honest a conversation as either of them had ever had. It was Ruthie who finally said what everyone was thinking. She walked right up to Ezra one May afternoon while he was oiling a saddle. "Are you going to marry my mother?" Ezra stopped mid-motion. "Why do you ask?" "Because you look at her the way Papa used to. And she smiles when you're not looking. And Tobias already calls you Pa when you're not in the room." Ezra set the oil down and looked at this fierce little girl with her wild curls and her total lack of patience for grown-up nonsense. "Would that be all right with you?" he asked. "I've got conditions," she said. "Of course you do. I keep my egg ledger. Nobody touches my records. And I get a horse for my birthday. Seems fair." "Then yes," she said. "It'd be all right." That evening, Ezra proposed to Margaret. No ring, no big speech. He sat next to her in the rocking chair. He'd fixed with his own hands and said, "I put up that notice looking for a cook. Turns out I found something a whole lot bigger than that." Margaret looked at him, eyes full, the sunset turning her face gold. "Are you asking me to stay, Mr. Caldwell?" "I'm asking you to stay, Margaret." First time he'd said her name out loud. And the sound of it, coming from a voice that had demanded silence from the whole world for 9 years, was enough. "Then I'll stay," she said. "We'll all stay." They married that June. Right there in the yard between the house and the barn. Caleb stood beside Ezra holding the ring. Ruthie stood beside her mother with her ledger, fully intent on documenting the event with the same seriousness she gave her egg counts. Tobias held Scout in one hand and Scout's partner in the other, and when the preacher asked if anyone objected, Tobias held up both wooden mules and announced, "Scout says yes." Everyone laughed. Even Ezra. A real laugh, deep and a little rusty from 9 years of not being used. It caught him off guard, the way sunrise catches a man who's been sitting in the dark so long he forgot light was even a thing that existed. Years went by. Caleb grew into a rancher in his own right. Ruthie became, without question, the most organized person for 100 miles in any direction. Tobias grew up working with horses and never once let anyone forget it all started with a wooden mule named Scout. And Ezra Caldwell, the man who once nailed up a sign asking the world for quiet, spent the rest of his life surrounded by the best noise he'd ever heard. That old notice stayed pinned up outside the general store for years afterward, faded and curled and barely readable. But everybody in Millbrook knew what it said, and everybody knew what answered it. Not a cook, a family, the kind that walks through your gate when you're not even looking for one. The kind that leaves biscuits on your table and takes your walls apart one meal at a time, until you can't remember why you built them in the first place. So here's what I want you to sit with. Somewhere out there, you've probably got your own version of that sign nailed up. Some wall you built because it hurt less than the alternative. Maybe it's time to ask yourself what you're really protecting, and what you might be missing on the other side of it.